The strangest love stories never begin with a first kiss. Sometimes, they begin with a driving lesson. I failed my driver's test twice before I turned 21, and by the second failure, I was convinced the Department of Motor Vehicles had secretly framed my picture on a wall labeled "Do Not Pass under any circumstances." My best friend, Lucas Brooks, laughed so hard when I told him that he nearly spilled his fries across the diner table. "You're hopeless," he said between laughs. "No," I corrected him, poking at my cheeseburger. "Hopeless people don't spend $200 on driving lessons just to get told they hesitate too much at four-way stops." Lucas wiped tears from his eyes and shrugged. "Easy fix. My dad will teach you." I almost dropped my soda. "Your dad?" "Yeah." He said it like he was offering me an extra napkin. "Dad taught half the neighborhood how to drive when we were kids. He's patient. You'll be fine." Patient wasn't exactly the word I associated with parents. My own father believed yelling directions louder somehow made them easier to follow. The last time he'd tried teaching me, I'd pulled into a grocery store parking lot, climbed out of the driver's seat, and declared I would gladly walk everywhere for the rest of my life. But Lucas looked completely serious. "Trust me," he said. "If anyone can get you to pass, it's Nathan." 2 days later, I found myself standing outside the Brooks family house at exactly 9 o'clock on a bright Saturday morning. The July sun was already warming the quiet suburban street. Kids rode bicycles past freshly cut lawns, while someone nearby grilled bacon that smelled unfairly amazing. I almost turned around twice before ringing the doorbell. The door swung open sooner than I expected. "You must be Noah." The voice was calm, warm, and somehow reassuring before I even looked up. Then I did. Nathan Brooks was taller than I remembered from high school football games years ago, where he'd always been somewhere in the background cheering for Lucas. His dark brown hair carried the first hints of silver at the temples, and faint laugh lines framed kind blue eyes that somehow made me feel less nervous in an instant. He wore jeans, worn leather sneakers, and a simple navy polo, looking more like someone's favorite uncle than the intimidating driving instructor I had imagined. He smiled and held out his hand. "Ready to conquer the roads?" I laughed nervously. Honestly, I'd settle for surviving the parking lot. His grin widened just enough to make me forget every speech I'd rehearsed on the drive over. "Fair goal. Let's start there." The family SUV waited in the driveway, clean but clearly well used. Nathan walked around it slowly, explaining mirrors, blind spots, and seat adjustments with the kind of patience teachers in movies always seem to have, but rarely existed in real life. He never rushed me, never sighed when I asked the same question twice, never looked disappointed when my hands trembled gripping the steering wheel. "Take your time," he said as I adjusted the mirrors for what felt like the 5th time. "Nobody's grading you today." Those 6 words settled something inside me that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. Nobody's grading you today. For the first time since I'd started learning to drive, I actually believed I might not fail before I even turned the key. Nathan did not begin by teaching me how to drive. He began by teaching me how to breathe. "Before you touch the gas," he said, resting one arm casually against the passenger door, "look as far down the road as you can. The car usually follows your eyes." It sounded less like driving advice and more like something pulled from a self-help book, but when I lifted my eyes beyond the hood instead of staring at the pavement directly in front of me, the steering wheel suddenly felt less unpredictable. We spent almost an hour circling the empty parking lot behind an old shopping center. I practiced gentle turns, smooth stops, and parking between faded yellow lines that had clearly survived more summers than I had. Every mistake earned the same reaction. Nathan would smile, wait for the car to stop, and calmly explain what happened. There was never a raised voice, never a disappointed sigh. When I accidentally hit the windshield wipers instead of the turn signal for what had to be the 6th time, I groaned and dropped my forehead onto the steering wheel. "I am never getting my license." Nathan chuckled beside me. "You know how many people have said that sitting in this exact seat?" I looked over. "Please tell me I am not the worst." "Not even close." His eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. One teenager drove through a drive-thru without realizing he was supposed to stop before the menu. Another somehow managed to park facing the wrong direction in an empty lot. I blinked. That cannot be real. Unfortunately for my blood pressure, it is. I laughed so hard I forgot to be embarrassed. The rest of the lesson passed faster than I expected. Before I left, Nathan handed me a small notebook. "Homework," he said. I frowned. There is homework for driving? Not really. He tapped the cover. Every time you finish practicing, write down one thing you did well before you write down what needs work. I stared at him. Why? Because people like you only remember their mistakes. His words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. I had spent years believing improvement meant constantly pointing out everything I had done wrong. The idea of noticing something I had done right felt almost unfamiliar. You are making that face, Nathan said. What face? The one that says you think I am giving you cheesy life advice. I laughed again. Maybe a little. Fair enough. He smiled. Just humor me. By the following Saturday, I had filled nearly half the notebook. At first, the victories were tiny. I remembered to check my mirrors. I made a smoother right turn. I parked without crossing the line. Somehow, writing them down made them feel real. When I arrived for our second lesson, Nathan noticed the notebook sticking out of my backpack before I even mentioned it. You actually did it. I figured if I ignored my homework, you would fail me. Good thing I do not give grades. He climbed into the passenger seat with a travel mug of coffee that smelled like vanilla. Today we leave the parking lot. My stomach flipped. Already. You are ready. That is a dangerous amount of confidence. He laughed quietly. Noah, confidence is borrowed before it becomes your own. You can borrow mine until yours catches up. I looked out through the windshield toward the quiet neighborhood streets stretching into the warm morning sunlight. For reasons I could not explain, hearing him say he believed in me made it easier to believe it myself. I started the engine, took a slow breath, and pulled onto the road, unaware that somewhere between stop signs, conversations, and shared laughter, I had already begun looking forward to these Saturday mornings far more than I should have. The first time it rained during one of our lessons, I almost asked to cancel. Dark clouds rolled across the sky before I even left my apartment, and by the time I reached the Brooks house, steady drops drummed against the windshield hard enough to blur the world beyond the glass. Nathan stepped out of the garage carrying 2 umbrellas and smiled, as if gloomy weather had personally arrived to entertain him. Perfect timing, he said. I stared at him. You and I have very different definitions of perfect. He laughed, folding one umbrella before climbing into the passenger seat. If you can drive confidently in the rain, a sunny afternoon will feel easy. Or I could panic, embarrass myself, and hydroplane into someone's mailbox. That is why I am here. Somehow, hearing those 4 words settled my nerves again. We eased onto quiet residential streets where the rain painted silver ribbons across the pavement. The windshield wipers swept back and forth with steady rhythm while water gathered along the curbs. Every passing car left gentle sprays behind its tires, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. Relax your shoulders, Nathan said softly. I had not even realized they were tense until I let out a slow breath. You carry stress like you think it makes you safer. Does it not? No. He looked out through the rain-speckled windshield. It usually just makes people forget to enjoy where they are. That sentence lingered in my head far longer than it probably should have. We stopped at a small neighborhood coffee shop after an hour of driving because the rain intensified into a heavy summer downpour. The windows fogged slightly from the warmth. Inside, while customers chatted quietly over steaming mugs, Nathan ordered black coffee. I ordered hot chocolate, which earned me an amused smile. Do not judge me, I said, wrapping both hands around the cup. I never judge hot chocolate. You definitely thought about it. Maybe for half a second. I rolled my eyes dramatically. I knew it. He chuckled, and somehow the sound blended perfectly with the soft music playing through the cafe speakers. We talked about everything except driving. He asked about my college classes, my dream of becoming an industrial designer, and the sketchbook I always carried but rarely showed anyone. I learned he had spent years designing community buildings because he liked creating places where people could gather. He spoke about his work with quiet pride, never boasting, simply grateful that his job allowed him to leave something useful behind. There was something unexpectedly comforting about the way he listened. He never interrupted, never glanced at his phone. When I spoke, I felt like my words actually mattered. On the drive back, the rain finally eased into a light mist. I felt calmer than I had all morning, until a delivery truck suddenly turned into our lane farther ahead than I expected. My heartbeat jumped. I instinctively pressed the brake a little too hard, and the car came to an awkward stop. Easy, Nathan said in the same calm voice he always used. You saw it. You reacted. That is what matters. I exhaled shakily. I thought I messed everything up. Noah. He waited until I looked at him. A perfect driver is not someone who never gets nervous. It is someone who stays present when they do. I nodded slowly, though my pulse was still catching up. The rest of the drive passed quietly, but not awkwardly. Comfortable silence settled between us, broken only by the gentle hum of the tires on wet pavement. As I pulled into his driveway, the late afternoon sun finally slipped through the clouds, turning the lingering raindrops into tiny flashes of light across the neighborhood. I caught myself smiling before I even realized why. It was no longer just about learning how to drive. Somewhere between rainy roads, warm conversations, and the steady reassurance in Nathan's voice, these weekends had quietly become the part of my week I looked forward to most, and that realization lingered with me all the way home. By August, our Saturday lessons had become something that neither of us questioned anymore. I would show up a few minutes early, and Nathan would already be outside with 2 travel mugs, one filled with black coffee for him and one filled with hot chocolate for me, because, despite my repeated insistence that I was perfectly capable of drinking coffee like an adult, he claimed I always looked happier holding hot chocolate. "You are impossible," I said one morning as he handed me the familiar cup. "That is what Lucas tells me every week," he replied with a grin. I consider it a compliment. The neighborhood gradually gave way to busier streets. We practiced merging onto highways, navigating crowded intersections, and parallel parking between orange traffic cones that Nathan had borrowed from a friend. Every lesson ended the same way. We reviewed what went well before discussing what needed improvement. It became our routine, simple enough that I stopped noticing how much I depended on it until one Saturday, when Nathan received an unexpected phone call just before we were supposed to leave. He apologized with genuine regret. "I need about 20 minutes. A contractor has a question about one of my projects." "No problem," I said. "I can wait." I wandered into the garage while he finished the call inside the house. Shelves lined the walls, filled with neatly labeled boxes, old baseball gloves, camping gear, and framed family photographs waiting to be hung somewhere. One picture caught my attention. Lucas, at maybe 8 years old, sat on his father's shoulders during a 4th of July parade, both of them laughing so hard that neither seemed aware a camera had captured the moment forever. Another showed Nathan standing beside a much younger Lucas on the day he learned to ride a bicycle. The training wheels rested on the driveway behind them. Nathan looked exactly the same as he did now whenever I successfully completed a difficult turn, proud without making the moment about himself. Those were simpler days. I turned to find Nathan leaning against the doorway, phone tucked into his pocket. "Lucas still blames me for letting go of the bicycle too early." I smiled at the photograph. "Did you?" "Absolutely." He laughed. He yelled that he would never forgive me. Did he? About 3 hours later, after he realized he could ride on his own, we stood there quietly for a moment. The garage smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh-cut grass, and sunlight slipped through the open door in long golden stripes across the concrete floor. "You know," Nathan said, "teaching someone usually has very little to do with instructions." I looked over. "Then what does it have to do with helping them believe they can eventually stop needing you?" I nodded, but something about that answer unexpectedly tightened my chest. I told myself it was because I was finally close to taking the driving test. That was all. Nothing more. During the lesson that afternoon, we drove farther than ever before, winding through quiet country roads where rolling fields stretched beneath a brilliant blue sky. We talked about music, favorite books, and childhood memories that somehow felt easier to share inside a moving car. At one point, I admitted that I had almost switched majors during my sophomore year because I thought I was not talented enough. Nathan shook his head gently. "Do not confuse self-doubt with truth." "Easy for you to say." "Not really." His smile faded into something thoughtful. "Everyone carries a voice that tells them they are not enough. The trick is deciding which voice deserves your attention." His words settled into the silence between us as I watched the road curve gently ahead. Later that evening, after I returned home, my phone buzzed with a message from Lucas. It was nothing unusual, just an invitation to grab burgers the following weekend. I smiled as I started typing a reply, but my fingers stopped halfway through the sentence when I realized something strange. For the first time since Lucas and I had become friends, the person I had spent the most time thinking about that day had not been him. It had been his father, and that quiet realization lingered long after I set my phone down, refusing to leave my thoughts. September arrived with cooler mornings and the first hints of autumn hiding among the maple trees that lined Nathan's neighborhood. My driving test was only 3 weeks away, yet our lessons felt less like preparation and more like a tradition neither of us wanted to rush toward ending. That Saturday, Nathan suggested we take a longer route through the countryside before returning to town. There is less traffic, he explained, and better scenery. He was right. Golden fields stretched for miles beneath an impossibly blue sky, interrupted only by old red barns and white fences that looked like postcards come to life. I rolled down the window just enough to let the crisp air drift into the car. This is nice, I admitted. Nathan glanced out the windshield with a small smile. Sometimes people forget the destination because they are too busy worrying about every turn. I laughed softly. You really do turn everything into life advice. Occupational hazard. You are an architect. Exactly. We spend years thinking about foundations. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. Around noon, we stopped at a roadside diner that looked as though it had not changed since the 1970s. The waitress greeted Nathan by name, which immediately made me suspicious. How often do you come here? I asked after she walked away. Often enough that they know I always order the turkey club. That explains everything. What exactly does it explain? You secretly have an entire life outside of teaching hopeless college students how to park. He laughed, the familiar sound warm enough to make the little booth feel even cozier. I certainly hope so. Lunch passed easily, filled with stories about embarrassing family vacations, disastrous home improvement projects, and Lucas accidentally locking himself out of the house while wearing nothing but socks because he had chased the family dog across the yard. I laughed until my stomach hurt. It felt effortless, comfortable in a way that quietly surprised me. As we walked back toward the parking lot, I noticed an older couple slowly crossing in front of us, their fingers loosely intertwined. Nathan instinctively stepped aside to give them room, smiling politely as they passed. The woman smiled back before telling her husband, "Still opening doors for me after 40 years. He answered with a grin that carried decades of quiet affection. Best habit I ever learned. I watched them disappear toward an old pickup truck before realizing Nathan had noticed me staring. They come here almost every Saturday, he said. I have seen them for years. They seem happy. They choose to be. His answer lingered in the silence as we climbed back into the SUV. On the drive home, my thoughts refused to settle. I caught myself watching the way sunlight filtered through the windshield onto Nathan's hands as he pointed out an upcoming turn, the calm rhythm of his voice, the easy kindness that never seemed forced. Somewhere over the past several weeks, admiration had quietly crossed a line I had never intended to approach. The realization arrived without drama, almost gently, yet it stole the air from my lungs all the same. I was not simply looking forward to our driving lessons anymore. I was looking forward to seeing him, talking with him, hearing him laugh. The truth settled into my chest with terrifying clarity, and I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as if it could somehow keep my thoughts from drifting any farther. Nathan looked over, noticing my silence. Everything all right? I forced a smile that felt smaller than usual. Yes, I answered, hoping my voice sounded convincing. Just thinking. He nodded without pressing further, trusting me the way he always had. That trust made the truth feel even heavier, because for the first time since this journey had begun, I was no longer afraid of failing my driving test. I was afraid of what would happen if the person who had taught me to believe in myself ever discovered the secret I had just admitted to my own heart. The week before my driving test, I made a decision that felt responsible, mature, and completely impossible to follow. I would put some distance between Nathan and me. Not physically, emotionally. I told myself our lessons would stay exactly what they had always been. Driving lessons. Friendly conversations. Nothing more. I repeated that promise every morning like it was capable of changing reality. It was not. If anything, becoming aware of my feelings only made me notice everything more. The way he always waited until I buckled my seat belt before starting his own. The quiet smile that appeared whenever I successfully handled a difficult intersection. The habit of lowering the radio whenever I started telling a story, as though every word deserved his full attention. None of those things meant anything beyond simple kindness. That was exactly the problem. They meant everything to me because they were simply who he was. During one lesson, we stopped at a scenic overlook above a small lake surrounded by trees beginning to glow with shades of orange and gold. Nathan suggested taking a short break after nearly 2 hours on the road. We leaned against the wooden fence with paper cups of cider warming our hands while a cool breeze rippled across the water below. "You have improved a lot," he said after a comfortable silence. "I mean that. I still get nervous. So do experienced drivers." He smiled. "Confidence is not the absence of fear. It is learning that fear does not always deserve the final vote." I laughed softly. "You know, somebody should really start writing your advice down. Please do not encourage me. Lucas already claims I collect inspirational quotes like baseball cards." I looked out across the lake before speaking again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you agree to teach me in the first place?" He seemed surprised by the question. "Because Lucas asked." I nodded, pretending that answer was enough. Then he continued, "But I kept teaching you because I enjoyed spending time with you." My heart stumbled so suddenly that I hoped the wind was loud enough to hide the silence that followed. Nathan looked completely unaware of what those words had done inside my head. To him, they had probably been a simple compliment. To me, they echoed far longer than they should have. That evening I met Lucas for dinner, something we had postponed for weeks because our schedules kept colliding. Halfway through our burgers, he looked at me over a basket of fries and narrowed his eyes. "You are smiling more lately." "Am I?" "Definitely." He took another bite before adding, "Dad says you are almost ready for the test." I nodded. "I think so. He likes teaching you." My fork paused in midair. "He said that." Lucas shrugged casually. "He told my aunt last weekend that you actually listen instead of pretending you already know everything." He laughed. "Apparently that makes you one of his favorite students." Favorite student. The word should have made me happy. Instead, they quietly reminded me of exactly where I belonged in his life. A student. A friend of his son. Nothing more. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we had shared over the past 2 months. I searched for hidden meanings that probably did not exist, then felt guilty for searching at all. By morning, I had reached another decision. Once I passed my driving test, I would thank Nathan for everything he had done, return the notebook he had given me, and quietly let life return to normal. It seemed like the kindest choice for everyone involved. I just did not realize that life had already started making plans of its own, and those plans were about to change everything I thought I understood. The morning of my driving test arrived with the kind of clear blue sky that felt almost suspicious, as though the universe had decided to remove every possible excuse. Nathan picked me up an hour early, so we could practice one last time before heading to the testing center. Neither of us talked much during the first few miles. I assumed he was giving me space to focus. In truth, I needed it. Every stop sign reminded me that this chapter was ending. Every green light carried us closer to the moment when I would no longer have a reason to spend every Saturday beside him. "You are awfully quiet today," Nathan finally said as we waited at a red light. "Just thinking." He smiled knowingly. "You do a lot of that." "Occupational hazard." He laughed, recognizing his own phrase. "Careful. You are starting to sound like me." I wanted to answer that maybe I already had. Instead, I simply smiled and kept my eyes on the road. The test itself passed in a blur. Parallel parking, lane changes, stop signs, speed limits. Everything Nathan had patiently repeated over the past several months seemed to appear exactly when I needed it. I could almost hear his calm voice before every maneuver. "Look farther ahead. Breathe first. Do not rush." When the examiner finally smiled and said, "Congratulations. You passed," I stared at him for several seconds before the words actually reached my brain. Outside the building, Nathan stood beside the SUV with his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The moment he saw my expression, his face lit up before I could even speak. "You passed." It was not a question. I laughed. "Was it that obvious?" "Your smile gave you away." Before I realized what I was doing, I crossed the distance between us and wrapped him in a quick hug. It lasted only a second before I stepped back, suddenly aware of what I had done. "Sorry," I said, my face warming. Nathan's expression remained gentle. "You do not have to apologize for being happy." He reached into the back seat and pulled out a small gift bag. "Open it." Inside was a polished keychain shaped like a tiny compass. Engraved on the back were the words, "Trust yourself. You already know the way." My throat tightened. "Nathan, consider it a graduation present." I traced the letters with my thumb, unable to find the right words. We celebrated with lunch at the same roadside diner where we had stopped weeks earlier. The waitress cheered when she heard I had earned my license and insisted on bringing an extra slice of homemade apple pie to our table. For a little while, everything felt wonderfully normal. Then, just as we were finishing dessert, my phone buzzed. It was Lucas. I answered with a smile. Guess who finally passed? I already know, he replied. Dad texted me 20 minutes ago. I glanced across the booth. Nathan looked suddenly interested in stirring his coffee. Lucas laughed on the other end of the line. Listen, can you both come by the house tonight? I want to celebrate. Sure, I answered. See you later. That evening, after dinner and far too much teasing about my former driving abilities, Lucas asked if I could help him carry a box from the garage. As soon as the garage door closed behind us, he folded his arms and looked directly at me. Can I ask you something? My stomach tightened. Of course. He hesitated just long enough for my heartbeat to grow louder. Am I imagining things? He asked quietly. Or have you and my dad become really important to each other? The air seemed to stop moving. For one suspended moment, every answer I could possibly give disappeared, and I realized the careful distance I had promised myself only days earlier had quietly vanished long before I ever noticed it. My mouth opened, then closed again. Lucas watched me with the same calm expression he always wore when he already knew the answer to the question he was asking. I am sorry, I said quietly. I never meant for anything to become complicated. He leaned against an old workbench and sighed. That is not actually an answer. I looked down at the concrete floor, suddenly fascinated by a tiny crack running across it. I know. The silence stretched between us, not angry, just uncertain. Finally, Lucas spoke again. You care about him. It was not a question this time. I nodded once, unable to pretend anymore. Yes. Saying the word out loud felt terrifying and strangely relieving at the same time. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck before letting out a long breath. I kind of figured. I blinked. You did? Not at first. A small smile appeared on his face. But then Dad started mentioning you all the time. Noah finally mastered parallel parking. Noah got an A on his design project. Noah found a new coffee shop downtown. It was like you quietly became part of every conversation. I stared at him, unable to speak. Then I noticed something else, he continued. You smiled differently whenever his name came up. I laughed nervously. Apparently, I am terrible at hiding things. You are. He grinned for a moment before his expression softened again. Can I tell you something honestly? Always. He folded his arms loosely. I have not seen my dad this happy in a very long time. That answer caught me completely off guard. After Mom passed away, Lucas continued gently. He spent years taking care of everyone else. Me, work, family, friends. He forgot that he deserved happiness too. I swallowed hard. Lucas, I am not saying this is simple. He shook his head. There is an age difference. People will have opinions. They always do. He shrugged. But those people do not live our lives. My eyes stung unexpectedly. You are really okay with this? He smiled, smaller this time but completely sincere. The only thing I care about is whether the two people I love most are kind to each other. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Lucas laughed quietly. Besides, if anybody deserves the challenge of keeping my stubborn father from working every weekend, it is probably you. I laughed too, the nervous tension finally easing from my shoulders. When we walked back into the house, Nathan looked up from the kitchen island almost immediately. His eyes moved between Lucas and me as if trying to read a conversation that had already ended. Everything all right? He asked. Lucas answered before I could. Everything is fine. He reached into the refrigerator for another bottle of sparkling water as though nothing unusual had happened. The evening continued with board games, homemade cookies, and stories from Lucas's childhood that embarrassed him just enough to entertain the rest of us. Yet beneath the laughter, I noticed Nathan watching me once or twice with quiet curiosity. He could tell something had changed. He just did not know what. When I finally stood to leave, Nathan walked me to my car as he always did. Cool autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves through the quiet neighborhood. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the small compass keychain he had given me earlier that day. Thank you, I said softly, for teaching me so much more than driving. Nathan smiled with the same gentle warmth that had first put me at ease months earlier. You already had everything you needed, Noah. I just reminded you to trust yourself. For the first time, instead of looking away, I met his eyes and held his gaze. Something unspoken passed quietly between us, not a confession, not a promise, but the unmistakable feeling that both of us had arrived at the edge of the same unknown road, waiting to discover who would find the courage to take the first step. The leaves had almost completely fallen by the time Nathan called and asked if I wanted to take one last drive before winter settled in. "You do not need lessons anymore," he said with a quiet laugh over the phone. "I know," I replied, "but I would not mind the company." We met early on a Saturday morning and headed toward the same country roads where I had once struggled to stay between the lines. This time I drove with easy confidence, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel, the little compass keychain swaying gently beneath the ignition every time the car rounded a curve. Nathan noticed it almost immediately. "You kept it." I smiled without taking my eyes off the road. "I carry it everywhere." He looked out the window, and I thought I saw him smile to himself. We stopped at the scenic overlook where we had shared hot cider weeks before. The lake reflected a pale autumn sky, perfectly still except for the occasional ripple from a passing breeze. Neither of us spoke right away. It felt unnecessary. Finally, Nathan rested his hands on the wooden fence and exhaled slowly. "Lucas, talked to me." My heartbeat stumbled. I turned toward him, searching his expression for disappointment, confusion, anything that would prepare me for what came next. Instead, I found quiet honesty. "He told me about your conversation." I lowered my eyes. "I never wanted to make things difficult for your family." Nathan stepped a little closer, though he left enough space for the choice to remain mine. "You did not." His voice remained calm, the same steady voice that had guided me through every nervous turn and uncertain intersection. The difficult part was admitting something I had been trying very hard not to think about. I looked back at him. "What do you mean?" He smiled, though there was vulnerability in it I had never seen before. "Somewhere between parking lots, rainy afternoons, and too many cups of coffee for me and hot chocolate for you, I stopped looking forward to teaching my students lessons." He laughed softly at himself. I started looking forward to seeing Noah. The world seemed to grow wonderfully quiet. Even the breeze across the lake felt gentler somehow. "I thought I was the only one," I admitted. Nathan shook his head. "That is why I kept reminding both of us that these were only driving lessons." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that comes after carrying something heavy for far too long. "I was afraid," I confessed. "So was I." He looked toward the lake before continuing. "Not because of what people might think. Because I never wanted you to wonder whether I had taken advantage of the trust you placed in me." I answered without hesitation. "You never did. You gave me confidence when I had none. You treated me with kindness when I expected criticism. You helped me become someone I actually like." His eyes softened. "And you reminded me that life does not end just because we convince ourselves our happiest chapters are already behind us." We stood together in comfortable silence before I reached over and gently took his hand. He looked down briefly, then intertwined his fingers with mine naturally, as though they had been finding their way there all along. There was no dramatic moment, no audience, no perfect soundtrack. Just two people choosing honesty after months of quiet fear. A year later, I drove my own car to the grand opening of Nathan's new community design studio, where my industrial design team had collaborated on several interior features. Lucas greeted us at the entrance with an exaggerated sigh before tossing me a spare set of keys. "Congratulations," he said with a grin. "You passed the hardest driving test, and somehow you also convinced my father to leave work before sunset once in a while. That might be the bigger miracle." Nathan laughed beside me, shaking his head. I slipped the new keys onto the same little compass keychain he had given me the day I earned my license. The engraving had faded slightly from everyday use, but the words were still clear. "Trust yourself. You already know the way." Looking back, I realized he had never just taught me how to drive. He had quietly shown me how to stop living in fear, how to trust, kindness, and how the best journeys are not measured by miles on the road, but by the people who choose to travel beside you.